feel ready to go. I'll stand there. Oh, wait a minute. Before you, let's. Well, good morning, everyone. How do we like this blue sky sunny day we have today? I am John Mann, Director of Education for Lakeside, and this year we are celebrating the cultural and geographic regions in the United States, and during week 8 of the lecture series, we will explore the region of the U.S. known as the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes region is known for its abundant fresh water, vibrant outdoor recreation, and strong industrial history, with railroad connections and terminals serving as key drivers of its economic growth. And we are fortunate that Bruce Allen is here today to share his love of history and his understanding of the fascinating world of steam travel in the first half of the 20th century. Bruce is retired from the field of architecture after 45 years and has been pursuing a career in publishing ever since. And he has written several books, including a history of Hudson's Detroit's world-famous department store. And this morning's presentation is the D&C Lake Lines and the fabulous lines of the Great Lakes. And it's supported by Mary Lou and Don Leffler. I would ask you would please mute your cell phone ringers if you haven't already, and help me in welcoming Bruce.
Good morning, everybody. It's so nice to see a big crowd here, and I want to thank you for coming and spending some time with me. I know there's probably not that many things you can do on a smoky day like today. Doggone Canadians. So, pardon me?
In here, inside, it's smoke-free.
It's smoke-free, yeah. We're doing our best to stay inside on a day like today. But you could do something else with your lives. I'm so thankful, really, from the bottom of my heart that you've decided to come and spend some time with me to talk about this topic. Now, I want to start with a little anecdote that I didn't even plan to put in this lecture, but last night I had the great pleasure, even though it was a little, the smoke, you could see the smoke coming, I sat on the pier with my wife and we watched the sun go down. But there's this beautiful panoramic view, and you can see the Perry's Victory Memorial across Lake Erie. And I began to think about the lecture that I'm giving tomorrow, which is strictly about the Cleveland and Buffalo Transit Company that was headquartered in Cleveland. And those boats of theirs, they had a very big business between Cleveland and Buffalo, but they also had an excursion service that went from Cleveland to Put-in-Bay, to Port Clinton, and then across to Toledo. And in later years, that was handled by one of these boats. It was a reconstruction of one of the older boats. So I started to imagine what it would be like to be sitting there watching the sunset, but seeing one of the great D&C ships, or one of this excursion liner, which was called the Good Time, that would be traveling across the lake. And in my mind's eye, I could create that, right? Because as an architect, I'm very visual. So, and I thought, wow, here I'm sitting I'm right among this history. So it's really appropriate that I can share some of this with you today. So with that, let's get started. A little video introduction there. So what you see here is a Cleveland and Buffalo ship, the C&B, and it was known as the Great Ship C&B because it was so large. It was built in 1913. But in this case, it's taking an excursion of Ford dealership. Of course, it's leaving from Detroit, which was not one of its general ports of call, but it's taking an excursion for the employees of Ford dealerships for having good sales that year. Everybody got to go on a trip on the C&B. So it gives you an idea of how massive. This is Detroit's Belle Isle Park in the middle of the Detroit River, and you could see these giant ships coming by. So that was a little bit of my image last night watching the sundown, trying to imagine what it was like to see something like that on a regular basis right across the lake. And that is very much my inspiration for talking about this topic. If a person is an enthusiast, if you know all about maritime history of the Great Lakes, it's a natural. This book has got, I had a very good compliment from somebody in that whole area, publisher of, I don't know if anybody around here buys Know Your Ships. It's a little book that will tell you as you every year it comes out, and you can look up the names of ships you see on the Great Lakes, the freighters, where they came from, what line, what's their tonnage, how long. And that's been a tradition. I remember my father having that book way back in the 1960s. But the publisher of that told me, I gave him a copy of my book, he bought a copy of my book, and he said, nobody needs to write anything more ever again, you've got it all. So that was kind of a nice compliment, right? And I do tend to throw the kitchen sink at everything because I'm detail-oriented. But my inspiration was that I remember some of this. I remember hearing about it. I'll show you some things that I saw as a child. And then you start to find the connections. Like there's a gentleman here that actually took a trip as a child from Cleveland to Detroit on one of these ships. He was small, he doesn't remember exactly which one it was, but it was sometime after World War II before these lines went out of business. So this history is all around us, and I found it very gratifying, and I hope you do too, that through the internet in a lot of ways, a lot of bad on the internet, but there's a lot of good too, that we can determine some of this, see it, and actually understand what came before us. There are 7 cruise lines now doing Great Lakes cruises. They're outrageously expensive, I'll tell you, but you can have that same experience in one way or another. You can still be on a large, comfortable boat in the middle of a lake and not see any shore and anticipate a destination in one of the Great Lakes ports today. So in some ways, some of it is back. So that was my book. You can see it afterwards, but a lot of times when I write history books, and several of my books are about old department stores that people enjoyed shopping at, those things are gone. The whole concept is gone. In Cleveland, Higbee's is a casino now. It's nice that the building is preserved because our Hudson's wasn't. It was imploded. But it's not Higbee's, right? It's not shopping. You can't go down there and have somebody walk you through what suit looks best on you or something like that. That whole era and the era and aura, I would say, are gone. And you just go there and leave money now. So before you used to go leave money and get some merchandise in return. So here, this is what it is. But I'm often asked like that, people say, well, who cares? Hudson's was only a store. But it wasn't only a store. It was where mothers went with their daughters to pick out a bride's gown. It's where people bought their first baby layette. It's where people met for lunch and did some shopping. For many people, I'm sure this is the same in downtown Cleveland, get on the bus, the ladies put on their white gloves and their best outfit and hat, went downtown shopping, had lunch, maybe saw a movie, and then came home in the evening. So it was a part of the culture and the life at the time. Same thing with these ships, and I'm focusing a little bit on Detroit because the Detroit and Cleveland Navigation Company was the finest, the largest, and the best of everything. It was really the #1 steamship operator in the whole world in terms of fresh water, not salt water, but on fresh water. So who cares? Well, some of the things I just talked about, that this was our lives, right? It was our lives, shopping in department stores, going to the theater downtown, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's part of our culture. I like to go to Europe and travel. There I go see palaces, castles, great pieces of architecture, museums. But our culture here was more of even though we inherited many of those things from Europe, we also have a commercial culture. So like they said in the Soviet Union, their subway stations were beautiful, but their hotels were flea bag, right? Here, our hotels were beautiful, but our subways were flea bag. It was a complete different philosophy of life. And so a lot of what we created as a commercial culture was great and certainly worth remembering. Now, in Detroit, our Tiger Stadium is gone. It was originally known as Briggs Stadium. Very little of this is actually left. There's some nice buildings that have been renovated, as I believe Dan Gilbert's done work in Cleveland as well. Of course, our giant Hudson's store, the tallest department store in the world and the third largest department store in the world, was twice the size of what Higbee's was in Cleveland. That's gone. The whole idea of shopping there is gone. Our Boblo boats are gone. Like I talked about, those excursion ships that would come from Cleveland to Put-in Bay and so on and so forth. That's gone. There's very, very little that's left. I think you probably had trolleys in Cleveland. We had trolleys in Detroit that my mother used to talk about. Well, I took this trolley here and I took that trolley there. That's gone. So it's really important. Now, if you look at the skyline of Detroit, you see I call it a pyramidal shape with the tallest buildings of the Penobscot building, kind of Terminal Tower used to be the tallest building in Cleveland. But where all that bulk meets the river, look at the line of big steamships there. So those ships are all, this photo was probably taken in the morning or afternoon, where these ships are waiting to board people for different destinations, for Cleveland, for Buffalo, for Mackinac Island. And that happened pretty much every day. So these ships were glued to that very image. And in Cleveland, the terminal was the 9th Street Pier. At one time it was on the Cuyahoga River, which was really difficult for steamships. So another thing about who cares is this first picture was of a popular excursion boat that traveled from Toledo north to Port Huron. And the name of the ship is the Tajmo. And there was a park on Harson's Island at the mouth of in the flats where the St. Clair River spread out into Lake St. Clair. And that Tajmo, I know because my mother said she rode on it. And she was a little girl. So she was born in 1925, and that didn't work out. 1925, and this Tajmo sunk at Amherstburg, Ontario in 1932. So she was probably between 5, 7 years old maybe, and she remembered going to Tajmo Park on Harson's Island via the Tajmo. Her parents took her, my grandparents. So it's important to me to know my mom, who I lost quite a few years ago, but I still recall her memory. So this is something that I find fascinating. Likewise, a very good friend of mine, who now lives in Florida, sent me this picture when I told him I was writing this book. So here's my friend Larry. There's his sister Mary Ellen, his cousins, his mother, his aunt, his father. And what are all these people doing? They're waving goodbye to, as he called it, his aunt and uncle, and in their family they called it Wanda and her Joe. They would say, oh, Wanda and her Joe are taking a cruise on the SS South American in 1966. So what did everybody do? Everybody went down to the dock and waved them bon voyage. That you just don't see that, really. I mean, maybe in New York when ships leave port, maybe that's still done, but it's obviously it was a big thing for him. So this history is entwined in people's lives. It's entwined in your life because you were there. This is a lady named Beatrice Bolte. This is a picture taken on the Great Lakes Transit Company's ship Octorara in the 1930s. When she graduated from high school, she took a cruise with a girlfriend on the Octorara. She left Detroit. The ship came to Buffalo, Cleveland, back through Detroit, all the way up to Sault Ste. Marie, all the way in Lake Superior to Duluth. Now, my wife, Carol, who's here, worked with Beatrice's granddaughter's husband. I went to a luncheon, I met her name's Janet, and she said, my favorite thing to do, I used to love to listen to my grandmother talk, but she would tell me about this cruise she took on the 1930s. And she said, but it scared me because I thought 1930s, the world was almost at war, there was turmoil, there was a depression. She was only 18 years old, maybe 17, 18 years old, and she went with a girlfriend by themselves all the way to Duluth, Minnesota on a boat. I don't know how she wasn't terrified, but she said, you know what my grandmother told me? No, it was lovely. It was one of the most wonderful things that I recall in my life. When my parents got the tickets for us, they asked the question, are they going to be all right? And they said, no, don't worry. When you get on the ship, they're protected by the captain. They are in charge of the crew. They will look after them and make sure everything goes well. And she said, so Everybody knew who we were. The whole staff knew who we were. We got to sit at the captain's table one night. When we went on excursions, they had people from the boat went and made sure that we didn't get lost or anything like that. I had a marvelous time. I'll never forget it. Luckily for us, Beatrice Bolte left a whole photo album that I was able to scan and use some of the photos of. And I love this one because she's standing right on the railing, probably opposite her cabin on that steamship. So it is important. It does matter. How did this happen? Really, the Great Lakes are the biggest body of fresh water in the whole world, taken together. And obviously they flow from Lake Superior all the way out to the sea at the mouth of the Gulf of the St. Lawrence River. But initially, as America gained independence, fought the War of 1812, there was a huge boom of people. Later on, it was my own grandparents that sought to get away from tyranny. They were in a country that didn't exist because Russia took it over. They were forced into another faith, which they didn't mind because they practiced their faith and this other faith. They're both Christian, so Orthodox and Catholic. So but my grandfather was in the Tsar Nicholas's cavalry, and he told my grandmother, he said, I'm sick and tired of going off with these people when they go off to the steppes of Central Asia, today's Ukraine, and fight wars for them when they're not, I want to go to America, I want to start a new life. How brave, right? He worked for 2 years to be able to afford a ticket for her. He remained faithful to her, which a lot of people didn't, and all that kind of thing. So it's part of my life too, but all these immigrants came from Europe, and mostly, if they're coming to America, they'd come to New York. A lot of Canadian immigrants would come through Montreal or Halifax, but once in New York, you've got to get to the west, because Chicago, can't find my light, but Chicago there is the railroad hub of America. It was then. You know, the Transcontinental Railroad, 1869, everything could go west. The Great Northern by the financier James J. Hill, he built this whole railroad, and there were no cities, there was nothing. And so then he said, I got to populate this. So he sent agents to Scandinavia and brought back all the Scandinavian, Norwegian, Swedish, Danish people, and offered them a new life for a $10 passage. They could take the ship and get onto a train and get to one of these new cities that were developing around where he built his railroad line. So it was a huge mass of people. So in order to get to Chicago, in that day, we didn't have online booking, didn't have cell phones. You just walked to the dock and found a boat that was going in the direction and made a deal with the captain. There were no set fees, nothing. So, and imagine if you don't really speak the language. That's an added difficulty. But you'd have to get yourself to Albany first. So you could take a steamship up the Hudson River to Albany. Once there, you had to go from the steamship terminal to the beginning of the Erie Canal, where you went through that same negotiation process to get to Buffalo. From Buffalo, you took a steamer to Cleveland. Once you're in Cleveland, there was no steamer at the time that could carry enough coal to get all the way from Buffalo to Detroit. So once in Cleveland, you got on another steamer to go to Detroit. The reason for that is that Michigan had the Michigan Central Railroad, which was a pioneer, and by 1857, I believe it had made it all the way to Lake Michigan. So you could get on a train there, and then at the little burg of New Buffalo, which interestingly enough, New Buffalo, you'd have to get on another steamer to go across to Chicago. This would take 3 weeks, okay? So if you imagine today, doggone, a whole hour and a half flight. We say, I hate sitting on a plane for an hour and a half. But imagine the arduous journey that these people took. Well, in time, that system improved, because you then had the New York Central Railroad followed that path. You could take the train from Grand Central Station all the way to Buffalo, et cetera, et cetera. And so really these steamships played a big part in that. The early ones were wooden ships. If you know anything about wood, you know if you put it in the water, it starts to rot. And the painting technology at the time wasn't great, but so they would paint the wood, but that would immediately begin to peel. The Michigan Central Railroad, knowing that it needed passengers to come to Detroit to fill its trains to go west, started working with captains on Lake Erie to get them from Cleveland to Detroit. And so they had a loosely formed organization that was called the Michigan Central Steamship Line, and it would operate these steamships overnight between Buffalo and Cleveland. The line eventually became owned by the captains that owned the ships, but these ships lasted maybe only 2 years. They would rot out, the hulls would rot out, they become unsafe. And what happened though is that the steam engines in these ships they had much more longevity. So they would last a long time. So what you could do is scrap the hull, but take the steam engine and put it into a new ship, and you could go. So they operated a variety of ships. I just want to draw your attention to one thing here. For some reason that's not showing on the screen. But above the deck of each of those ships, you can see a frame-like arrangement, and that is called the walking beam. That's an indicator of a very old technology. So you have a steam engine that is somehow rotating in the hull, right? And these are all side wheel ships. So you can see the foam around the middle there and that rounded thing called the wheel box that covered up the paddle wheels. So there was a steam engine down in the hull at one point, and there had to be a rod that went all the way up through the roof of the steamer to that walking beam, and that walking beam would go like this, so that when the steam engine pushed this one up, it pushed that one down, and you see that one end of it is pretty much in line with the paddle wheels. So that thing would have to go like this as it was traveling. Very ungainly, it caused vibration, but at the technology of the time, that's all they could do. So, and can imagine, you'll see in an example later, the loss of energy that happens when you have to pump something up all the way above a roof, across an iron beam, and then down just to get to where the power is needed. So a lot of power was lost in that case. But that was the way it was. And sometimes those things would snap. They were made out of iron, and they would just snap. They'd fail on an immediate basis and be dangerous too. So in 1867, a law was passed in Michigan that it was possible to form corporations to transport people from one place to another, like a stagecoach line or a railroad line or a steamship line in this case. That loosely arranged group got together and was formed. The captains owned it, some industrial magnates owned it, and they formed what was called the Detroit and Cleveland Steam Navigation Company. And they also used ships that they just picked up off the market. Whatever seemed like good, it wasn't too rotted out, well, we're gonna run that one this year. The company was formed early in 1868, but by June, one of their ships that was called the Morning Star left Cleveland at night to head to Detroit. It was sort of a balmy June night. And there was a schooner with a load of lumber from northern Michigan coming down Lake Erie, but that schooner's crew had let their lights go out, so nobody could see it. As you know, all boats have a red light and a green light, and because based on which side you see the red or the green on means whether the ship is going away from you or coming forward. Well, there was a terrible crash. The schooner ran right into the Morning Star, and the captain could do nothing. It was in fog. The ship just showed up right next to him. The problem was it hit right at that is the Morning Star at the bottom. It hit right at the paddle wheel and got entangled in the paddle wheel. So the steam engine kept on going, and that schooner kept bashing into the wooden hull of that ship, and it sunk within minutes. So there was a terrible loss of life. People were washed up ashore, like as far as Erie afterwards. They don't even know how many people died because there were some survivors. The captain did what he could in the moment to get people into lifeboats and things like that. They claim officially 38 people died, but probably more because the only people that were registered to go on the ship were the ones that had cabins. But if you didn't have the money to have a cabin, you just sat on the deck or in a lounge in case of bad weather. So they don't know how many people walked on that night even. So it was a big tragedy. I believe that company, from the time of that, when forming and having a tragedy happen like that, something in the psyche of those founding people said, we can't do this like this. It's not really a way to go. They had insurance, so they were reimbursed for the boat and everything, but how do you run a business when it's not considered safe? So I think from that point on, the D&C company became known as the safest, the best, etc. And it really lived its whole life that way. Never lost a passenger. While it was owned eventually by the McMillan family, who became a senator, they did not lose a single passenger on one of their ships. There were some suicides, but that's not their fault. So they had another ship. This colored photo there is of the RN Rice. That was their flagship at the time that they bought from another line. It burned at the dock. So you had the sinking by collision, now you had the destruction by fire. Luckily, the ship was sitting like those in that skyline view. There was no passengers on board. They were waiting to load. So the fire destroyed everything but the engine, and the hull was believed good. Put it into dry dock to rebuild it, but the hull was all rotted anyway, so they had to scrap it. So from that point on, that was 1877. In 1878, well, actually that was the year that James McMillan came on board. Because of all this trouble with the ships, the line knew that it had to buy new ships to be able to continue traffic. But nobody had the money for it. The stockholders had their money in the company, but there was profit to a degree, but not enough to continuously renew the ship fleet. So the management decided that they were going to ask the stockholders to each come up with an extra $5. You're going to pay a $5 assessment on every share of stock, and then we'll have money to build new ships. These people were older. They were the old sea captains, the old way, and they said, forget it. We're going to just get rid of our stock. We don't want to do any of this. Just leave it the way it is. Well, up came James McMillan, who was of a Scottish background, grew up in Hamilton, Ontario, but realized when he came to the shore of the Detroit River, saw a panorama of Detroit with all the smokestacks belching steam, and said, I want to be there. That's where the money's going to be, and my future's going to be there. So he became an American, moved to Detroit, and became one of the biggest industrialists in the area at the time. He was in the business of building railroad cars. This was before Detroit became the Motor City. And building forging iron rails for the railroads, making railroad car wheels that could be distributed all over the country wherever railroad cars are being built. And he invested in the Michigan Central and other things as well. So he came in and said, you people don't want to spend that assessment? I'll buy your stock. So he had the money. They built ships. It was 1878. After he came on in 1877, the company started for the first time building ships to their desires, their needs, purpose-built ships that could take exactly the number of passengers they felt was the right amount, enough cargo freight. All these ships I'm talking about today carried cargo. Generally, in the front of the main deck of most of them had a very wide open space. You could bring a car if you wanted to get a car from one place to another. It's a $5 charge in the 1930s, I think, to take a car on board. And in some ways, the Cleveland and Buffalo line, the DNC line, all of them, because they carried freight, they were the Federal Express of their day because it wasn't giant containerized freight. You could bring a package down to the dock, get a receipt for it, and they'd put it on the ship and take it to Cleveland, take it to Buffalo, wherever they were going. So they were the Federal Express of their day in a lot of ways. But even, you could see here, when I showed that map, like in Detroit, you had to transfer from a ship to a train to get on the Michigan Central Railway. Well, this is the terminal on the Detroit River that doesn't exist anymore. It's where the old hockey arena was, and they're building some really ugly high-rises right on the water there. But this is the terminal of the DNC line, and that's referred to as the Wayne Pavilion because this 3rd Street was known as Wayne Street, named after the Anthony Wayne. This is the Wayne Hotel in Mineral Baths. This is the freight depot of the DNC line. And this tower, and you can see some of the building here, but that's the old Michigan Central Station. So this picture, maybe from 1910 or something like that, shows a very early intermodal transportation where you could get off a ship and just walk to the train station or have a porter carry your luggage if you needed. And you could get from one method of transportation to another. I'm sure that the trolleys came down their buses. And this pavilion was also the event space, large event space on the 2nd floor for that hotel. It's where the very first auto shows were ever held. It was in the Wayne Pavilion at that location as well. So it's a big part of the city right there on the river. Also had a very lovely garden at one time that was meant to sort of humanize our waterfront a little bit, which was very industrial at the time. So along with, if James McMillan was the money, Frank Kirby was the brains. Frank Kirby was born on the outskirts of Cleveland. He moved with his father to Saginaw, Michigan. His father was a contractor and built factories, powerhouses, and things like that. So when Frank was growing up, he had an aptitude, and his father's wealthy clients that were hiring the father to build these structures, he became known to them, and they said, your son is really bright. You should really send him to New York for an education. So he went to New York, was educated in engineering at Cooper Union, and he specialized. He loved the steamships on the Hudson River. So he got, through his connections, he was able to get a pass that he could go on any one of those steamships any day for the purposes of observation only. So he would go and watch how the crew worked. He'd watch how the steam engines were taken care of. That became his specialty. When he came back to Detroit, his father had invested in an iron shipbuilding, an iron rail building yard in Detroit, and there was an industrialist that wanted to convert it because he believed that ships could be built out of iron. So Frank Kirby became the designer for this plant that eventually became the Detroit Dry Dock Company. And he was the absolute dean of naval architects in the United States. His name was known globally. He had an adventure where the Tsar of Russia, that same guy that caused trouble for my grandfather, had a need for the Trans-Siberian Railway, had a need to get ferries across Lake Baikal in Siberia. They couldn't build the line for many years around the bottom because of land conditions and things like that. So rather than having the line have a break in it, they wanted to have these ferries. Well, Frank Kirby designed all the car ferries that mashed up the ice at Mackinac, got people from the two peninsulas of Michigan. And so they had him come to Russia with plans, bring your plans with you, to build these ships. Well, when he got there, they pretty much put him under house arrest, stole the plans, gave it to a British shipbuilding company, and he was screwed. And they said that, like, when the train that he was on, when finally they let him go, when the train he was on crossed the border out of Russia, that he got up in the aisle of the car and danced and said, "Yee, I'm out of there, I'm done with this stuff." So he had quite an adventure, but he was known globally for this. He worked, he advised the US Navy on their ships and all this, and he designed all of the D&C and C&B line ships on the Great Lakes. Most of the big passenger ships became his design. They were absolutely safe. He was a stickler for performance, for safety above all, fire safety. They had fire suppression systems in it, so there were no longer any catastrophic fires on these ships. And until the D&C line went out of Macmillan family control in 1947, they had never had a fatality due to their operation. After that, it did happen. So this is the Detroit Dry Dock Company. In Cleveland, you had several. You had the Globe Iron Company built ships, Cleveland Shipbuilding Company, and eventually most of these became a conglomerate in 1899 that put together most of the big shipyards in the United States, which was good for the coming wars because they were able to work on war material. It was called the American Shipbuilding Company, and I don't know, does anybody here know who the last president, eventually through the 60s, 70s, even to the 2000s, the company had stopped building ships. It was really a ship repair company in Tampa, Florida. But anybody know who the last? George Steinbrenner, yes, Seinfeld and the New York Yankees fame. So interesting how, again, it's all kind of connected, right? So this is the situation we had ourselves in. And obviously Frank Kirby was all about innovation, all about the best way of doing things. So among the first, they built these first ships. The first one that they built was the old city of Detroit, and it had a wooden hull, but it was reinforced with steel. So they're taking steps toward these steel-hulled boats, which had much more longevity to them. Eventually came up with some bigger ships. The city of Cleveland 2 was an iron-hulled ship. The first steel-hulled was the city of Detroit 2. And you can see these also have the walking beam above their decks. But one of the innovations that Frank Kirby brought, he didn't invent it, but he brought it to these ships, was what was called the feathering paddle wheel. So there was the first passenger and freight steamship on the Great Lakes was called Walk in the Water. Its paddle wheel was a bunch of boards that just went around like this. So what the feathering paddle wheel did, it's the actual, what they called the bucket, the part that hit the water, and it was like a convex or concave rectangular piece of steel that now could come like this, but as it hit the water, it swiveled, so it actually scooped that water and pushed it past with the greatest of efficiency because of its design, which now made your ships faster. So instead of a day-and-a-half journey, you're getting closer to an overnight journey and that kind of thing. So that was a huge innovation. The other one came along a little bit later. So this line got to be quite large. And they had their bread and butter line was Detroit to Cleveland. In 1902, they built really the two of what I call the fabulous luxury liners. They were the first, the eastern states and western states, that were capable of traveling all the way to Buffalo. So they had a line from Detroit to Buffalo, a line from Detroit to Cleveland, and also they did operate a line from Toledo up through along the coast of Michigan to Mackinac Island. That was an early part of their steamship operations. Eventually that was replaced with more modern steamships that were able to go up all the way to Mackinac and all the way down to Chicago. So you could do a cruise, let's say, where you got on the ship, got off at Mackinac for a couple days, and you could catch 5 days later, catch another ship coming back to Detroit, or you could go down to Chicago and do the same thing all around. And they also did some cruises on the Great Lakes that took them to Midland, Ontario, and on Georgian Bay, and so on and so forth. And these luxury liners that they built collectively became known as the Grand Fleet of the Great Lakes, and they truly were grand. The eastern states and the western states were the first two for that Buffalo line on the top. Those are followed by new ships for the Detroit to Cleveland route, which was the City of Detroit 3 and the City of Cleveland 3, which were absolute monstrous, huge, almost between 400 and 500 feet long ships with beautiful interiors. And then in 1924, 1925, at the very end of, by this time the D&C company made so much money they could just buy ships for cash. So they spent $7 million to build, at the time, in 1923, to build two of the most colossal ships ever built for freshwater travel, which was the Greater Detroit and the Greater Buffalo, and those were for the Detroit to Buffalo route, which was their most popular eventually. So this Detroit and Buffalo line was formed by both the C&B and the D&C lines at the time in 1902 to operate ships between Buffalo and Detroit, and they were known as the Eastern States, Western States. Paddle wheelers, but you'll notice something, there's no walking beam above their roof. So Kirby brought out, and these were the first two ships to use what was called, if that was a vertical steam engine, a propeller ship uses a reciprocating steam engine that drives a propeller shaft. What this had was called an inclined steam engine. So sitting right on the hull, the steam engine was canted at an angle, and the piston from the steam engine went like this. And so what that was, it was connected then by rods across there. The grayed-in portion of the little circle there is the actual drive shaft of the paddle wheels, and there were a system of cranks and rods that then cranked that paddle wheel. So all this thing had to do is go like this, and it was connected directly to the drive shaft of the paddle wheels. Very efficient. Now you weren't taking energy and putting it up above the roof and coming down. It was just turning that paddle wheel right near the steam engine itself. That made these ships faster than anything else. There was a time, the Cleveland and Buffalo line had two pretty nice ships, but they were still the old style walking beam type. And when the Eastern States was new in 1902, the captain, Duncan McLaughlin, was coming into Buffalo, and he saw the competing Cleveland and Buffalo ship, City of Buffalo, coming from Cleveland. They were going to come into the dock around the same time. So he gunned it. And next thing you know, he left the C&B line ship, because that was now all new publicity, right, for how fast that ship was. The captains were forbidden from engaging in any racing. That was against the safety rules, because you're getting into racing, maybe you're not thinking about. So when the ship docked, they asked the captain, they said, well, that was quite a race you had this morning. He said, no, we're not allowed to, it wasn't a race. I swear to you, it wasn't a race. And they said, okay, that's not. He said, but we did win. So, very clever way of getting around things. So with that experience, they needed to renew the ships on the Cleveland to Detroit line. In 1907, they built the City of Cleveland, 402 feet long. The keel length was actually longer than that over the stern and the bow. It was the largest steamship ever built for freshwater at the time. It could carry passengers in 322 staterooms, or something like a railroad cabin, or in parlors, which had a bathroom, and that was the first class accommodation, say. But this ship was absolutely gorgeous inside. The Detroit Dry Dock Company used an architect in Detroit by the name of Louis O. Kyle. Now, he was German by descent and excelled in detailing beautiful woodwork, because German carving is a very big thing. There's some wonderful examples still exist in Detroit of some of the carving of these German wood carvers that were incorporated into architecture. Well, same thing with this. So This is the main lobby of the City of Cleveland 3. And the remarkable things in there is that you would come in at the stairway level there from, give your ticket over, get your room assignment from the purser, and there was a grand staircase that led up. But at the entrance to that grand staircase, the ceiling was open, so you could see up 4 stories through that ship. Can you imagine being on a ship floating past here, and that somebody could see from the pier here, and that thing is floating by, and there are people listening to music in this lobby. There's a dining room, there's a woman's parlor, there are day lounges for people that didn't want to pay for overnight tickets. There was a pub in the bottom of the ship where, at the very stern, where you could drink the night away or dance the night away if you wanted. The orchestra in the dining room and things like that. And you can see all the gilt work, wood carving, and right above there's a structural beam that comes across the opening of the stairway there, and on that is a gilded golden frog with illuminated red eyes. And the verbiage on the beam there says, only for the use of passengers holding stateroom tickets. So if you were one of those day people, you stayed on the main floor, went down to the pub below, or in the dining room in that case too. But you had to have a ticket for one of those cabins to go up into this, what was called the Grand Salon, and spend your relaxing time there. And it makes sense because then there would be less noise probably outside the cabins and all that. But the reason the frog existed, the DNC's mascot was Froggy, the frog. It was on all their advertising, Christmas cards, whatever. Even their dinner china, when you got done eating your whitefish, there was, the pattern had a frog. Painted in the plate. It was kind of disconcerting to finish your meal and see a frog there. And I finished my meal yesterday, it was just like a greasy white plate. But in this case, you saw a frog. But the reason the frog was their mascot was because along the Detroit River, and obviously this business was all seasonal. They could not go in the ice. They were not icebreakers. So the shipping season went from May to maybe the end of October. But in May, after the ice had melted and it was possible to go on the river, the frogs were waking up along the seashore, and they would chirp and croak, and it was loud because at that time it was just a swamp. There was not the industry very early on, and there was a lot of swampland that led down to the water. So when the frogs chirped, it meant that the shipping season was going to start. So that they took that as their mascot. And I think I have some more examples of that. However, before the ship could be put into service, that happened. It burned at the dock. So all that gilt work, they hired one of the most famous muralists to do the ceiling murals. His name was William de Leftwich Dodge. He did the ceiling murals at the Library of Congress in Washington and the Buffalo City Hall later on in life. But that ship burned. Now, because it had a steel hull and a steel steam engine, only the superstructure, the cabins, all that carving beauty, the gilt work was gone. So they had to recreate it all. They had to have the artists repaint the murals, and the ship was delayed by a year. Now, when this thing was launched, the newspapers just had like a 10-page spread showing how fabulous, with a giant cutaway view, just how fabulous a piece of machinery this was. So it was quite an event. Well, now you had one big ship on the Cleveland line. You had to build another one, right, to have a second one. So they built the City of Detroit 3. This became the de facto flagship because it was beloved of people because of the beautiful design that it had. And the comfort, the service, it was literally the Queen Mary of its day. And it was giant. It was almost 500 feet long, 470 feet overall, 478, 530 staterooms. That meant that somewhere between 1,000 and 1,200, because some of these parlors could take 3 people, could sail overnight in comfort on the City of Detroit 3. Became very well known and very much appreciated of a ship. That's a tinted postcard view of the interior. Somewhat more subdued, it's more of a Georgian style interior, but you see there's custom light fixtures. Beautiful ceiling murals, again by the same artist. But there was one aspect of this ship that set it apart from all others, and it was called the Gothic Room. So way up on the top deck was a smoking lounge, or recreation room, but it was known for this beautiful, intricate wood carving that was patterned after a mansion outside of London called Strawberry Hill House. And so that's where Louis O'Kyle got his inspiration from. And this room was just magnificent. It had a stained glass window that was made in England by one of the most renowned stained glass window creators of the whole world. It had a pipe organ in it that could be played for entertainment, and it had a beautiful view out these windows out to the lake, a wide-ranging panoramic 360-degree view, more or less. And there's a picture of Lewis Kyle. This was his genius that made that happen. Today, the Gothic room was preserved, and you can see it in Detroit's Dawson Great Lakes Museum on Belle Isle. So this is a picture of the Gothic room, where I held a book launch for this book back in November. And the stained glass window is there. The pipe organ is gone, sadly, but it's created as the lobby of that museum. Now, the museum, some of the paintings in my book were done by a Jesuit priest from the University of Detroit, where I went to school. And he was there at the time. I crossed paths, but never met him. He was the primary Great Lakes historian, Father Dowling. And he was the premier, like I said, historian of the Great Lakes. So he founded that museum. It didn't become known as the Dawson. It was founded in an old schooner that was encased in concrete in the park, but it dry rotted. So money was raised later on to build the Dawson Great Lakes Museum. And the Dawsons were the Detroit area distributors of Pepsi products. So, but they had a boating heritage, so they wanted to fund that museum. In 1966, I believe, it was found out that when the City of Detroit 3 was scrapped in 1956 at the dock, and what they would do is pull out things that could be preserved and lay them on the dock, and people would drive by and make bids on stuff. So, and they could go in and see, like, hey, I want that pipe organ or whatever, as long as they could get it out, it was theirs. So a gentleman from Cleveland bought the woodwork of the Gothic room. He had the idea, he had a farm outside of Cleveland, he had the idea that he was going to incorporate this into a bar and restaurant he wanted to create. Unfortunately, he died 2 years after, and this sat in a storehouse in a barn on his farm until his heirs put it up for sale. And in 1965 or so, the museum bought it with help from the Daughters of the American Revolution, with a big contribution from them, and it was reinstalled as the lobby of that museum. So imagine me as a little kid with my dad taking us down to that museum and walking in there and looking at this, because it's like nothing I had ever seen, right? Growing up in Detroit, just everything was industrial, right? Nothing like I've ever seen before. It made a big impression on me, and it's still magnificent to go in there. You can see the LaSalle window, which depicts LaSalle setting his foot on American soil for the first time in the 1500s before he rowed his ship off and sunk it. Well, he got off and took a canoe down the Mississippi River, but the Griffin, Le Griffon, his ship never was really found. In 1923-24, it was clear that the Detroit to Buffalo line was their most profitable, most popular. The company had tons of money, so they just out of pocket built the Greater Detroit and the Greater Buffalo, which were, like I said, the biggest, they were over 500 feet long, colossus of a ship. And to show the public what they meant in advertisements, they stood each of these ships, in an illustration only, stood them up on their side. So on the left is the electrical building in Buffalo. That was the tallest building in Buffalo at the time. So that ship is clearly twice as tall as that building. It's twice as long as that building is tall. First National Bank building in Detroit, which still exists, it's a colossal building itself, but look at how much longer those ships were. And then Cleveland, at the time, the Discount building was, in 1923 and 1924, Cleveland Discount Bank was the tallest building at that time. So it shows you the size and the incredible nature of these ships. And the interiors, by this time Lewis Kyle had passed away, so they hired the W&J Sloan Company of New York, which was the home furnishers to the what we would call well, in my era they were called the robber barons. Now they're called the men who made America, and that kind of thing. Yeah, because they literally did, but all their beautiful Newport mansions and the Vanderbilt house in Asheville were furnished by the W&J Sloan Company. So where did the D&C line go when it was looking for the best was to them, and they patterned the interiors of these ships off of the Villa Madama in Rome, which was famous for its frescoes and all that. So they created a colorful, beautiful interior based on that classical tradition for the interior of these ships. But, like everything, time comes by. These lines struggled in the Depression. They had a brief recap in World War II when people didn't want to take a ship across the ocean and go to Germany, obviously. So they stayed in the United States, and taking these ships were very popular during the war. After the war, financier who had actually been in jail for bank embezzlement, but always seemed to weasel his way out of things, bought the company. He didn't say at the time, he said, I'm going to revitalize this, we're going to build new ships, it's going to be great. Really what he wanted to do, it was the D&C line, the Detroit and Cleveland Navigation Company. He wanted to create the D&C Trucking Company. Take the assets, sell them, scrap the ships, get what you can, moved to Denver, so it became the Denver and Chicago Trucking Company with the capital of this. So while he was operating, the McMillan family, they had a boardroom coup, and the McMillan family was out, who had run this company since 1877, and not long after that, the city of Cleveland III was on an excursion from Benton Harbor, Michigan, all the way around Mackinac to Detroit to go see a Detroit Tigers game. It was the Chamber of Commerce and it was rammed by a Norwegian freighter in fog. And 3 people died in that mishap because you can see that it hit right where the cabins were and things like that. So that was kind of the end of the line by the end of the 1950s. George Kolowich, who was the guy that did this, who maintained control of the company, they said he was visibly shocked at the damage that was done and everything, but in 1950 he shut the line down. There were no more seasons after the 1950 year, and the ships were disposed of. Interesting thing happened to the city of the Greater Detroit and the Greater Buffalo, and another large ship from the C&B line in Cleveland. They were converted into aircraft carriers in 1943. The ships were seized. They took down the superstructure, and they took the vent stacks that all the steam, and the smoke from the coal burning came through, and they diverted it to one side and just built a flat deck out of wood, and it became, voila, the world's only paddle-wheeled aircraft carrier. And you can see where the paddles are there. One of the great things about paddle wheelers is that they were very popular on the Great Lakes. Number one, they're stable. You know that Lake Erie can be a very stormy lake at times, very treacherous, and I'll talk about that, some of what happened on the eastern end of Lake Erie in my next lecture. But those ships, because they had the paddle wheels on the side and their decks extended over, they were wide and very, very stable, so nobody got seasick or anything like that. But they also didn't make a wake behind them like a propeller ship does. While there were propeller ships, the ship that Beatrice Bolte took on her cruise was a propeller-driven ship, but those things were hated. I traveled on the SS Aquarama, if anybody remembers that, from Detroit to Cleveland on a Sunday outing with my parents, and I was, I want to say 4 or 5, and I still remember wearing my little light blue pedal pushers with a white piping all over them, and all this stuff that happened on the Aquarama. Well, one of the reasons why the Aquarama wasn't a success was because the huge wake from its propeller to make it so fast destroyed docks all along the river, and people sued and that. So the paddle wheelers didn't do that because they didn't have a wake, really. But here, this aircraft carrier, I diverge, okay? The aircraft carrier never saw combat. It was mainly designed as a training ship. The conversion happened in 1943, and they were stationed at the Great Lakes Naval Base, because at the time we didn't have Air Force because it was the Navy, right? That was early flying planes. And that was stationed there, and they trained the pilots for the Pacific theater of the war to be able to land and take off on the deck of a heaving ship. So they would go all the way up to like Traverse City area and back on the lake and test this. As a result, that whole stretch of Lake Michigan is like a World War II aircraft graveyard. If the water was shallow enough, they would just pull it back out, dry it off, and use it again. The most famous person who ever trained on one of those aircraft carriers was George Herbert Walker Bush, our president. Being from Texas, he lived in a hot climate. In the winter on Lake Michigan, on this, in the wind, and flying an airplane that had no heating, no air conditioning, etc. George H.W. Bush's famous quote was, "It was the coldest I have ever been." So that was his experience there. So this is really where it all kind of came to an end. The city of Cleveland was towed to Windsor, Ontario, where it burned, no surprise, and then they towed the hull to Hamilton, Ontario, where the steel company there was adept at breaking up ship hulls. These last, really ignominious end came to the eastern states and the city of Greater Detroit. They were not, the scrapping company said it was too expensive to scrap them right off the bat, like at the dock. So they towed them into Lake St. Clair and did something which you could never imagine today. But one of the captains said, I remember the day that the Greater Detroit came here. Crowds came to see her and go through her. The papers were all full of her pictures. They let kids go up and blow on the whistle. It was a great day for Detroit. I saw her then in her day of triumph. I guess that was about 1924, 1925. So what they did was they towed these ships past downtown Detroit, and all the office buildings, people were at the windows waving goodbye, towed them out into Lake St. Clair and burned them at night on a frigid December night. And there was fireworks, it was like an event to go down and see these ships burn to hell, basically. And I've talked to people that actually lived in Grosse Pointe and saw that at the time. Can you imagine the environmental outcry today? This is in 1956. And his quotes, and as that ship was towed, he said, I felt I had to come down and see her today, hauled off by the tail like a dead cat. So all this magnificence, all of everything there just kind of went to hell. And I'm getting toward the end here. I am going to lecture tomorrow about the C&B line. There's a number of other lines that are covered in my books, and maybe sometime I'll come back. I don't know if anybody remembers the Georgian Bay line or the Chicago, Buffalo, and Duluth Steamship Company. They did call in Cleveland, and they were primarily a cruising line, and they had the SS North American and South American, which were white ships that were very distinctive. They were propeller driven. And there's others, a Canadian line that actually sent people down rapids on a ship on the St. Lawrence River. These ships would hit the rocks and they were protected. They had 2x4s all over their hull, but they said it was like riding a roller coaster. You'd get that sense of losing your stomach as the ship would go down these rapids, and that was considered part of the transportation. So the whole topic is really fascinating, but I'm going to bring it to an end here. And if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to discuss that. Yes, ma'am. Question? Oh, okay.
I was just wondering, when they burned the ships, the ship's hull was made out of metal, right?
Yes.
So what happened to that? Did it just sink into the bottom of the lake?
It did not sink. They were then towed back to Detroit and then ultimately towed to Hamilton, Ontario, where they were scrapped by the Steel Company of Canada there. Interesting thing about that is that the fire picture showed both the greater Detroit and the eastern states being burned. Well, it didn't go as easily as everybody thought. They wouldn't ignite. They were throwing Molotov cocktails. They had gas tanks on the decks. They were throwing Molotov cocktails. And it wasn't until like a tug captain went up to it and started the fire that it actually burned. They burned. The greater Detroit stayed there, but the eastern states broke off at one point, like it didn't want to burn, right? And then after the burning, the hull was towed back, and it broke from its chains and floated all the way down to Lake Erie before they could get it and bring it back to the terminal in Detroit, where it was going to sit for a while before it was scrapped. So it was one ship that didn't want to die, I guess.
Yeah, really well done.
Thank you.
Great presentation. You noted Frank Kirby.
Yes.
Frank designed a number of passenger steamers that actually frequented the Lakeside dock.
Yes.
But what I want you to talk about is the greatest steamboat race
Yes.
ever in the Great Lakes, and it was between two Frank Kirby boats.
So
Tell us about that.
in 1901, the Cleveland and Buffalo Transit Company, I have pictures of the race and some information about it in tomorrow's lecture. If you're interested, I'll go into it in more detail. That the owner of the White Star Line, which was the line that operated that ship Tajmo that I said my grandmother sailed on, made a quip that even though the Cleveland and Buffalo line had just built what was known as the City of Erie in 1898, and it was considered, its nickname was the Speed Queen of the Great Lakes. So and he said, my Tajmo could show that ship its tail. Basically, that's what they said. Like, you'll be looking at our tail if we race you. It's kind of what he said. And so this offended the management of the Thomas Newman was the name of the general manager of the Cleveland Buffalo line, and so this proposal to have a race sort of floated back and forth until And the guy in Detroit actually put up money and thinking he was going to bluff the C&B line, and the guy went, nope, you're on. So they arranged this race that was going to leave a certain point in the lake at Cleveland and go about as far as Erie. I think it was a 100-mile race, and there was a point to stop there. So on the prescribed day, these two ships were lined up right off the lakefront of Cleveland, and a gun was shot, and they took off. And it was the city of Erie that won over the Taj Mahal eventually. Part of it, that Sour Grapes was saying that, well, that wasn't the Taj Mahal's regular route, so she didn't know when they got into some sticky situation with shallow water and things like that, and they couldn't really gun it the way they wanted to. But the city of Erie did win. And the thing was, the prize was going to be a certain amount of money was put up, and then the mayor of either Detroit or Cleveland was going to be able to use that money for their own charity project after that. So it was a very famous thing. It's still talked about today. Every now and then when there's an anniversary of that, that was 100 years ago or it was 125 years ago, people talk about it a lot. And so that was very, very famous. And you don't get that with airlines nowadays, because they just never arrive online, right? They could even have a contest like which one's actually going to get your luggage to its destination. From my experience, I've flown all over the place the last 10 years. Like, forget it with luggage. We do a carry-on. We pack half our clothes in there because I've had it like the worst of the worst. But speed was a thing in those days because if you could get in a little bit earlier and all that, well, you were making an advantage for your passengers there. So it was great publicity because now everybody wanted to ride on the city of Erie, right? Because it was the speed queen of the Great Lakes, and truly was. It beat the Taj Mahal that everybody wanted to ride on anyway because it was such a great ship and very fast too. They were both designed by Frank Kirby. Of course, the city of Erie was what was called a night boat that had cabins for nighttime travel between Cleveland and Buffalo, whereas the Taj Mahal was simply an excursion ship that had decks with open chairs and might have some enclosed areas, a ballroom and that kind of thing on it for dancing, which was very popular because a lot of times when these ships would come by, if you were close to the shore and they came by at night, they were lit up beautifully and you could hear the orchestra playing and see people dancing, on the, inside through the windows and things like that. So, yes.
Fascinating. Fascinating to think about the leisurely nature of these. I'm too young, I guess, but I grew up in Buffalo in the 50s, and I don't remember seeing those, but the puff of smoke that you see in the pictures that you're showing, there's some boat left on Lake Michigan that goes between Ludington and Door County and has that big puff of smoke. Is it? Do you know about that boat? Or?
Yeah, well, I can tell you like the background of that, that these ships were coal-fired for the most part. Coal makes a lot, they talk about fresh lake air, and then you see pictures of these boats barreling down the lake with 3 stacks full of black smoke coming out of their stacks, and the decks had to have been covered with soot and everything. But in the 50s and late 40s after World War II, and even before that, the North American and South American had their boilers changed to be oil-fired. So that produced much, much less smoke. So then that was the case. Now the ship that you're talking about is the Badger, and it travels from Ludington, Michigan, where I designed the main bank in town, and to Manitowoc, Wisconsin, which is also a shipbuilding center and all that. And that was a part of the Pere Marquette Railroad. It was a car carrier, a railroad car carrier that was converted to carry passenger cars. So really, if you've got to get from northern Michigan west, it's a good way to go. And there's also, there's a modern jet boat like the one that goes to Put-in-Bay that leaves out of Muskegon to Milwaukee is another way to do that. And at the time, that one of the ships, not the one that Beatrice Bolte was on, but there were 3 identical ships of that line, the Great Lakes Transit Company, and one of them was turned into the Milwaukee Clipper, which for many years was the ferry boat between Muskegon and Milwaukee, which is preserved at the docks there as a museum ship at the state. There is one remaining, one of these great luxury liners. It's a Canadian ship of the Canadian Pacific Railway's Great Lakes service. So you could take the Canadian Pacific Railway across Canada, but if you didn't want to do the whole thing by train, you could take a fast train from Toronto just up to Georgian Bay and get on one of their lovely steamers and make a 2-day trip to Thunder Bay, Ontario, which was known as Port Arthur and Fort William then. And these ships were built in Scotland, in Glasgow. They went under their own power across the ocean into the St. Lawrence River. They got to Montreal, where they were cut in half, towed through the canals that bypass all these rapids on the St. Lawrence River before the St. Lawrence Seaway, and then towed through the Welland Canal, where they could not fit, to Buffalo, where they're welded back together, and then did 60 years of service between Port McNicoll, Ontario, and Thunder Bay at that time. And so one of those had a kind of a checkered life. After it was retired in 1966, it became a museum ship in South Haven, Michigan, or Douglas, Michigan, actually. And then it was taken to Port McNicoll, and the city there spent $1 million renovating it as a museum. And then a developer bought the docks and said, get that thing out of here. So it went to the Canadian Museum of the Great Lakes in Kingston, Ontario, and you can visit it today. That's the last remaining example of one of these ships. So, yes, sir.
Yes, with the Great Lakes being the highest concentration of shipwrecks in the world, there's numerous shipwrecks that I've been on. Are you going to speak to any of the shipwrecks and the preservation of wood versus steel on the bottom of freshwater Great Lakes?
Actually, a lot of these shipwrecks, primary areas for shipwrecks would be, I believe, off the coast of Alpena. It's called Thunder Bay there. There's
Correct.
A lot of
Yes.
shipwrecks there.
Yep.
But Lake Michigan, I like to refer to Lake Erie sometimes as a killer lake because it's so shallow. It's the shallowest of the Great Lakes. And you know that the waves are a product of not just what you see above the water, but the depth of the wave itself. So when the water's deep, the waves are not necessarily that big, but when the water's shallow, that wave is partially underwater, and then the rest of it goes above water, which makes it and storms blow up very quickly. Kind of wish we'd have a storm, because it maybe would get rid of some of that smoke in the air. But it's a lot of deaths on Lake Erie. But Lake Michigan, I was in Indiana and I gave a lecture last month around this time at a resort on a lake south of Chicago that has and I'm wearing their shirt that they so graciously gave me. I was gonna wear a jacket and a tie, and I said, nah, this is a casual place. But I have this beautiful shirt, and that museum runs what's called the Dewey Line, and they've got a lifeboat from the SS Alabama, which was a Lake Michigan ship, and they've converted it into a steamboat, and you can take trips on their lake on this little lifeboat steamboat thing. So I gave a lecture about the ship line, the Goodrich ship line, which was roughly contemporary with the D&C line, but on Lake Michigan. And my gosh, I don't know how that thing stayed in business with all the shipwrecks they had, between fires, between storms, getting caught in ice off of Grand Haven, Michigan, and being crushed by the ice flows, with a total loss of life. And all. So it's very popular now that people are going. There was one disaster in 1929, the SS Wisconsin, traveling between Chicago and Milwaukee, hit a storm, and the captain was frantically crying out, but nobody could get to it, and it sunk with a pretty hefty loss of life. And they had not found, even though it was really kind of off the shore, they had not found it. But within the last 20 years, it's been found and explored and all that. So obviously, then a lot of the Goodrich ships, even into this era that I talk about, were still wooden hulled. So there was just tinder, for ice flows and things like that. And the owner of the Goodrich line insisted that they could operate year-round on Lake Michigan. Well, they had cargo and they had passengers. They might do 90% passengers and 10% cargo in the summer, but in the winter there was maybe 1 or 2 passengers on board, and the rest was all cargo. Because they did a lot of fruit business across Lake Michigan, but it just was not safe or possible. So it's all those shipwrecks, and they are found. I don't know much about. If they're wooden, the wood is obviously just rotting in the water. Bowsprit. Mm-hmm. Yeah, perhaps the painting of it, or just maybe it was some really hard wood they used in that case that wouldn't rot as much as a pine wood or something like that. But steel, was obviously going to last longer. We're still going to the Titanic and all that. Anyone else? One more.
You mentioned the Aquarama, I believe.
Yes, I did.
Was that, can you tell us a little bit about that? I think even in the 1950s, wasn't that still operating?
I think it started in 57. I was born in 58. It was a war surplus ship, like a cargo ship that was converted and remodeled by a company known as the Sand Products Company in Muskegon, Michigan. And they had the idea to resurrect this kind of steamship operation on the Great Lakes with the Aquarema. Now that was strictly a day ship, so it did one-day runs between Detroit and Cleveland. And that lasted for maybe a good 10 years or so, but there were problems with the wake. It was a fast ship. The steam engines were powerful because they used to go on the ocean, but the wake of that ship did a lot of damage, so it was continually being complained about and sued over. So it just didn't last, and it was really, I could see it waiting at the docks in Sarnia, Ontario, as much as maybe 10 years ago, but it's since been scrapped. But it was, it was an attempt to try something new. It just never made it. Of course, we were in the See the USA in Your Chevrolet era that didn't really, and I could do a whole lecture on why these things dwindle out of popularity too. There's a lot of different factors. Government intervention is a big one that really caused this whole industry to end.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a nice day. I don't know if I didn't mention, but I do have copies of my books for sale. If nothing else, come take a look. You might enjoy just seeing some.